She had her own son blinded with hot irons so she could snatch the imperial crown. Another queen, after her husband was murdered, buried his killers alive, burned others in a bathhouse, and then slaughtered a whole town that betrayed her trust. And get this, one noblewoman became a pirate terror, all to get revenge on a king who wronged her family. Medieval times weren't just about knights and castles. Some women were playing the Game of Thrones for real, and they weren't afraid to get their hands dirty with some epic betrayals. Number 8. Eleanor of Aquitaine, the queen, who rebelled against her own king. Picture this. You're one of the wealthiest and most powerful women in Europe. You've been Queen of France, and now you're Queen of England, married to the formidable King Henry II. Sounds like a dream, right? Well, for Eleanor of Aquitaine, it became a gilded cage, and she wasn't about to stay locked up. Eleanor was no shrinking violet. Born around 1122, she inherited the vast Duchy of Aquitaine in southwestern France, making her a very eligible bachelorette. Her first marriage was to King Louis VII of France. She even went on the Second Crusade with him, which was pretty unheard of for a queen back then. But things soured. They were too different. He was devout and a bit dull. She was spirited and worldly. After 15 years and 2 daughters, but no sons, their marriage was annulled. Just weeks later, Eleanor did something super bold. She married Henry, Duke of Normandy, who was 11 years younger than her and soon to become King Henry II of England. This marriage united England with a massive chunk of France, Aquitaine. Together, they had a bunch of kids, including future kings, Richard the Lionheart and John. Yes, that King John of Magna Carta fame. For a while, things seemed okay. Henry was a powerful, energetic ruler, and Eleanor was his queen. But Henry was also, let's say, a bit of a control freak. He liked to be in charge of everything, including Eleanor's lands in Aquitaine. And he wasn't exactly faithful. The most famous of his mistresses was Rosamund Clifford. The fair Rosamund in legends, though probably not true, even had Eleanor poisoning her. The point is, the marriage got rocky. By the early 1170s, Eleanor was spending more time in her own lands of Aquitaine, running her own court in Poitiers, which was known for its culture and courts of love. Meanwhile, her sons were growing up. Henry, the young king, crowned king alongside his father but with no real power, Richard and Geoffrey all felt their dad wasn't giving them enough land or authority. They were chomping at the bit for more. And here's where the betrayal comes in. In 1173, Eleanor's sons decided to rebel against their father, King Henry II. This wasn't just a little family squabble. It was a full-blown war, known as the Great Revolt. And guess who was reportedly in on it, encouraging her sons? Yep, Eleanor. Sources from the time suggest Eleanor was a key player in stirring up her sons against their father. She had her own grievances with Henry II. She wanted more autonomy in Aquitaine, and she was fiercely protective of her sons' inheritance and rights. So when Henry the Young, King Richard and Geoffrey launched their rebellion, supported by the King of France, Eleanor's ex-husband's son, funnily enough, and other nobles, Eleanor decided to back her boys. She wasn't just cheering from the sidelines. Chronicles say she actively encouraged Richard and Geoffrey to join their older brother Henry. As the revolt gained steam, Eleanor herself tried to flee from Poitiers to join her sons in Paris. She even disguised herself as a man to make the journey. Talk about commitment. But her escape plan failed. King Henry II's men caught her, and Henry was not happy. His own wife conspiring with his own sons to overthrow him. That's a betrayal on a massive scale. The Great Revolt of 1173 to 1174 ultimately failed. Henry II was a skilled military leader and managed to defeat his rebellious sons and their allies. And what happened to Eleanor? Henry had her imprisoned for 16 years. 16. She was moved around various castles in England, kept under lock and key by the husband she had defied. It was only after Henry II's death in 1189 that Eleanor was finally freed by her favorite son, Richard the Lionheart, who then became king. And did she retire quietly? Nope. Eleanor, then in her late 60s, jumped right back into politics. She acted as regent in England, while Richard was off on the Third Crusade. She governed, raised his ransom when he was captured, and secured his kingdom. She even played a crucial role in ensuring her youngest son, John, succeeded Richard. Eleanor of Aquitaine lived into her 80s, an astonishing age for the time. Her life was a whirlwind of power, politics, culture, and yes, betrayal. Siding with her sons against her husband was a massive gamble, a direct challenge to the king and the accepted order of things. It cost her years of freedom, but it also showed her fierce determination and her willingness to play high-stakes political games. She wasn't just a queen, she was a force of nature who shaped the destiny of kingdoms. Number 7. Jeanne de Clisson, the Lioness of Brittany, who became a pirate avenger. Imagine your beloved husband is brutally executed by the king, betrayed and killed without a fair trial. What would you do, grieve? Seek justice through the courts? Jeanne de Clisson, a noblewoman from Brittany, chose a different path. She declared war on the King of France himself and became one of history's most terrifying pirates. This is a story of vengeance so epic, it sounds like a movie. Jeanne de Clisson was born around 1300 into Breton nobility. She was married 3 times, which wasn't unusual for aristocratic women of the era. Her 3rd husband was Olivier de Clisson, the 4th. They seemed to have a happy marriage and had several children. Olivier was a powerful Breton lord, and, like many nobles at the time, he was caught up in the complex politics of the 100 Years' War between England and France, and a nasty little local conflict called the Breton War of Succession. In this Breton War, there were 2 main claimants to the Duchy of Brittany: Charles de Blois, backed by the French king, and John de Montfort, backed by the English king. Olivier de Clisson initially fought for Charles de Blois, the French-backed guy. He even defended the city of Vannes for Charles. However, Vannes eventually fell to the English forces, and Olivier was captured. Here's where things get murky and tragic. Olivier was later released by the English in a prisoner exchange that the French especially Charles de Blois, found suspicious. They thought the ransom was too low. Whispers started that Olivier might have promised to switch sides or made some deal with the English. In 1343, Olivier de Clisson was invited to a tournament in Paris by King Philip VI of France. It seemed like a normal invitation, but it was a trap. Once Olivier arrived, he was arrested, accused of treason, and subjected to a sham trial. Without proper evidence or a real chance to defend himself, he was condemned to death. King Philip VI ordered his execution, and Olivier was beheaded in Les Halles in Paris. To add a gruesome insult to injury, his body was gibbeted, hung on public display, and his head was sent to Nantes in Brittany and displayed on a pike at the Savetou Gate. Jeanne was devastated and enraged. She believed her husband was innocent, a victim of political maneuvering and false accusations. Seeing his head displayed so horrifically was the last straw. She took her two young sons, Olivier and Guillaume, to Nantes to see their father's head. There she swore a terrible oath of vengeance against King Philip VI and Charles de Blois, whom she held responsible. And Jeanne wasn't kidding. This wasn't just an emotional outburst. It was the beginning of a calculated and ruthless campaign of revenge. She sold off her lands, her jewels, everything she owned to raise money. With these funds, she bought 3 warships. She had them painted black, and their sails dyed blood red. This terrifying squadron became known as the Black Fleet, with her 2 sons by her side. At least initially, Jeanne de Clisson took to the English Channel as a pirate her target. French ships, especially those belonging to King Philip VI or his allies. She became known as the Lioness of Brittany. Her pirate career was notoriously brutal. When her ships captured a French merchant vessel, she would often order the entire crew to be slaughtered, except for 1 or 2 sailors left alive to carry the tale of her fury back to the French king. It's said that she would sometimes personally behead French nobles captured on these ships with an axe, a chilling echo of her husband's fate. For 13 years, Jeanne and her Black Fleet terrorized the French coast. She attacked French shipping, raided coastal villages, and showed no mercy to those she considered her enemies. Her actions were a direct betrayal of her allegiance to the French crown, whatever was left of it after Olivier's death, and a shocking defiance of medieval norms for a noblewoman. She wasn't just a grieving widow. She was a warrior, a naval commander, and a symbol of resistance and vengeance. Her young son Guillaume died during their time at sea. Her other son, Olivier V de Clisson, survived and would later become a famous French military commander known as the Butcher, ironically fighting for the French crown in later stages of the 100 Years' War, though he always had a complicated relationship with it. After King Philip VI died in 1350, Jeanne continued her piracy against French shipping for a while. Eventually, around 1356, she retired from her life of piracy. She found refuge in England for a time, and later married for a 4th time to Sir Walter Bentley, an English military commander. She lived out the rest of her days, dying around 1359. Jeanne de Clisson's story is one of profound betrayal, leading to an even more profound and violent act of retribution. She turned personal grief into a one-woman war against a king. Whether you see her as a hero, a villain, or a tragic figure driven to extremes, there's no denying that the Lioness of Brittany masterminded a truly unforgettable betrayal of the established order, all in the name of love and vengeance. Number 6. Empress Irene of Athens, the mother who blinded her own son for an imperial crown. In the glittering cutthroat world of the Byzantine Empire, power was everything, and people would do almost anything to get it. But even by Byzantine standards, what Empress Irene did was shocking. She was a mother who loved power so much. She had her own son, the rightful emperor, arrested, deposed, and blinded, all so she could rule alone. Talk about a family feud gone nuclear. Irene was born in Athens around 752. She was an orphan, but known for her beauty and intelligence. This caught the eye of Emperor Constantine V. So Irene traveled to Constantinople, the magnificent capital of the Byzantine Empire, and in 769 she married Leo IV, also known as Leo the Khazar. When Emperor Constantine V died in 775, Irene's husband became Emperor Leo IV, and she became Empress Consort. They had one son, Constantine, born in 771. Leo IV's reign was relatively short. He died in 780 when their son Constantine was only 9 years old. This made young Constantine VI the new emperor, but because he was just a kid, Irene became his regent. She was now the one effectively ruling the massive Byzantine Empire. And Irene wasn't content to just keep the throne warm for her son. She had ambitions of her own. One of her first major acts was to deal with the big religious controversy of the day, iconoclasm. For decades, the Byzantine Empire had been officially against the veneration of religious icons, images of Christ, saints, etc., with previous emperors ordering their destruction. Irene, however, was an iconophile. She supported the use of icons. As regent, Irene cleverly maneuvered to restore the veneration of icons. This culminated in the Second Council of Nicaea in 787, which officially condemned iconoclasm and brought icons back into churches. This was a huge deal, and it made her popular with a large segment of the population in the church, though it angered the iconoclast factions, especially in the army. Meanwhile, her son Constantine VI was growing up. By the time he was a teenager, he started to resent his mother's tight grip on power. He wanted to rule in his own right, as was his due. Irene, however, wasn't ready to step aside. She had grown accustomed to being in charge. The sources say she even had her name placed before her sons in official documents, calling herself Irene Emperor in some cases, which was a bold move. The tension between mother and son grew. Constantine tried to assert his authority, and Irene resisted. There were plots and counterplots. In 790, some military units, unhappy with Irene's dominance and possibly her iconophile policies, proclaimed Constantine VI as the sole ruler. For a brief period, Irene was pushed aside, even placed under house arrest. It seemed like Constantine had finally won. But Irene was a master political player. She didn't give up. She worked behind the scenes, using her charm, intelligence, and network of supporters to regain influence. Incredibly, by 792, Constantine VI, perhaps missing his mother's advice or underestimating her ambition, officially restored her to her previous position as co-ruler. Big mistake. Huge. For the next few years, they ruled together. But it was an uneasy alliance. Constantine VI made some unpopular decisions. He divorced his wife, Maria of Amiens, who had been chosen by Irene, and married his mistress, Theodote, which caused a scandal known as the Moachian controversy over adultery. This damaged his reputation and gave Irene an opening. By 797, Irene decided it was time to make her move. She had carefully built up support among key officials and military figures. She saw her son's waning popularity as her chance. While Constantine VI was away from the capital, Irene's supporters launched a coup. Constantine tried to flee and gather loyal troops, but he was eventually captured. And here comes the truly horrific part, the ultimate betrayal. On Irene's orders, her own son, Constantine VI, the legitimate emperor, was brought to the Porphyry chamber in the imperial palace, the very room where he had been born. There, on August 15th, 797, his eyes were brutally gouged out. Blinding was a common Byzantine practice to make someone ineligible to rule, as an emperor was supposed to be physically perfect. Constantine VI died from his injuries shortly after, or lived on in obscurity, depending on which source you believe. Either way, his reign was over, thanks to his own mother. With her son out of the way, Irene became the first woman to rule the Roman Empire in her own name, not as a regent or a wife, but as sole ruler. She used the male title Basileus, emperor, not Basilissa, empress. For 5 years, Irene of Athens was the supreme ruler of the Byzantine world. Her reign was marked by some successes like fiscal reforms, but also by continued political instability and external threats. Her position as a female emperor was controversial, especially in Western Europe. In fact, Pope Leo III considered the imperial throne in Constantinople vacant because a woman held it, which was one of the justifications he used for crowning Charlemagne as Holy Roman Emperor in 800. Irene's ambition, however, ultimately led to her own downfall. In 802, a conspiracy of high-ranking officials, led by her finance minister Nikephoros, overthrew her. They were worried about her plans to possibly marry Charlemagne, a wild rumor, but it shows the anxieties of the time, or her erratic financial policies. Irene was deposed and exiled to the island of Lesbos. Her vast wealth was confiscated. She died there in 803, less than a year after her overthrow. Irene of Athens remains one of the most fascinating and ruthless figures in Byzantine history. She restored icons which earned her sainthood in the Eastern Orthodox Church. Yes, really. But her path to power was paved with the ultimate maternal betrayal, the deliberate, brutal removal of her own child from the throne and from sight. It's a chilling reminder of how far some would go for absolute power. Number 5. Princess Olga of Kiev, the saint who masterminded a fiery, bloody revenge. Before she was Saint Olga, she was a ruler faced with a brutal betrayal, and her response was so cunning, so ruthless, and so utterly devastating. It's become legendary. We're talking burying people alive, fiery bathhouses, and tricking an entire town into a death trap. This isn't your typical Sunday school saint story. Olga was the wife of Igor of Kiev, who ruled over Kievan Rus in the mid-10th century. Kievan Rus was a medieval state centered around modern-day Ukraine, Miols, and parts of Russia. In 945, Igor went to collect tribute from a tribe called the Drevlians. Apparently, he got greedy and tried to collect more than was agreed upon, or perhaps he collected it twice. The Drevlians were not amused. They captured Igor and, according to the Byzantine chronicler Leo the Deacon, killed him in a particularly gruesome way. They tied him to 2 bent-down birch trees and then let the trees spring back, tearing him apart. News of Igor's horrific death reached Olga in Kiev. She was now a widow, and her son Svyatoslav was only 3 years old, far too young to rule. So, Olga became regent. The Drevlians, feeling pretty bold after killing Igor, decided to take things a step further. They sent a delegation of 20 of their best men by boat to Kiev with a proposal for Olga. "We've killed your husband," they essentially said, "because he was like a wolf, plundering and ravening. But our princes are good. Marry our Prince Mal." Talk about adding insult to injury. They killed her husband and now wanted her to marry his murderer's relative and bring Kievan Rus under Drevlian control. Olga, however, was a woman of formidable intellect and steely resolve. She greeted the Drevlian envoys with apparent graciousness. "I shall send for you on the morrow, and you shall say, 'We will not ride on horses, nor go on foot. Carry us in our boat.'" The Drevlians, puffed up with pride, thought Olga was impressed and ready to submit. The next day, when Olga's people came for them, they did as she instructed, demanding to be carried in their boat. So, the people of Kiev carried the Drevlians in their boat onto the palace grounds. But Olga had a nasty surprise waiting. She had ordered a deep trench dug in the courtyard. When the Drevlians arrived, still in their boat, they were unceremoniously dumped into the trench. As they were being buried alive, Olga leaned over the edge and reportedly asked them if they found the honor to their taste. That was Drevlian Embassy number 1. Betrayal score: Olga 1, Drevlians 0. But Olga wasn't done. She then sent a message to the Drevlians saying, "If you really desire me, send me your distinguished men, so that I may go to your prince in due honor. Otherwise the people of Kiev will not let me go." The Drevlians, still clueless and thinking their first delegation was being feasted and honored, sent another group of their best men, chieftains this time. When this second Drevlian delegation arrived, Olga ordered her people to draw a bath for them, saying, "Wash yourselves and come to me." The Drevlians, tired from their journey, happily went to the bathhouse. Once they were inside, Olga's men bolted the doors and set the bathhouse on fire, burning them all alive. Betrayal score: Olga 2, Drevlians 0. Still not satisfied, Olga prepared for her third act of vengeance. She sent another message to the Drevlians. "I am now coming to you. Prepare great quantities of mead in the city where you killed my husband, that I may weep over his grave and hold a funeral feast for him." The Drevlians, perhaps finally getting a little suspicious, but maybe also thinking this was a genuine custom, did as she asked. Olga, with a small retinue, arrived at Igor's burial mound and wept. Then, the funeral feast began. Olga encouraged the Drevlians to drink heavily. When they were thoroughly drunk and incapacitated, Olga gave a signal to her soldiers, who fell upon the Drevlians and massacred them. The chronicle claims 5,000 Drevlians were killed that day. Betrayals score: Olga 3, Drevlians 0. But the grand finale of Olga's revenge was yet to come. In 946, she gathered an army and marched on the Drevlian lands, besieging their main city, Iskorostin, the very city where Igor was killed. The Drevlians fought back fiercely, and the siege dragged on for a year. Olga, realizing she couldn't take the city by force easily, resorted to one last ingenious act of deception. She sent a message to the besieged Drevlians. "Why do you persist in holding out? All your other cities have surrendered to me and submitted to tribute, so that the inhabitants now cultivate their fields and their lands in peace. But you had rather dine of hunger without submitting to tribute." The Drevlians replied that they would happily pay tribute, but they feared she was still bent on revenge. Olga then feigned mercy. She said, "I have already revenged the injuries to my husband. I do not desire further revenge, but am anxious to receive a small tribute. Give me 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from each house. I do not desire to impose a heavy tribute, like my husband, but I require only this small gift from you, for you are impoverished by the siege." The Drevlians, overjoyed at this seemingly light demand, quickly gathered the birds and sent them to Olga. They thought their ordeal was finally over. They were wrong. Olga instructed her soldiers to attach a piece of sulfur bound with small pieces of cloth to each bird. At nightfall, they lit the sulfur and released the birds. The pigeons and sparrows naturally flew back to their nests in the eaves, copes, and thatch roofs within the city of Iskorostin. The entire city was quickly engulfed in flames. As the terrified inhabitants fled the burning city, Olga's soldiers were waiting to capture or kill them. Some were killed, others enslaved, and the rest were subjected to heavy tribute. With the Drevlians utterly crushed, Olga's revenge was complete. She had systematically and brutally avenged her husband's murder using deception and psychological warfare as much as military might. Her actions secured her rule and sent a clear message to any other tribes thinking of challenging Kiev's authority. After this bloody episode, Olga's reign was marked by administrative reforms. She established trading posts and hunting reserves and rationalized the collection of tribute to avoid future conflicts, like the one that killed Igor. Later in her life, around 957, Olga converted to Eastern Orthodox Christianity in Constantinople, taking the Christian name Helena. She worked to spread Christianity in Kiev and Rus, though her son Sviatoslav remained a staunch pagan. For her efforts to Christianize her land, Olga was later proclaimed a saint in the Russian Orthodox Church. So, Saint Olga of Kiev was both a pious Christian evangelist and the mastermind behind one of the most elaborate and brutal revenge plots in medieval history. A series of betrayals born from an initial fatal betrayal against her husband. It's a stark reminder that medieval saints could have some very, very dark chapters in their life stories. Number 4. Joanna I of Naples the queen, accused of strangling her husband with golden cords. Imagine being a young queen in a kingdom known for its beauty, culture, and deadly political games. Now imagine your husband, also young and royal, is found murdered in a super suspicious way, and everyone starts pointing fingers at you and your lover. That was the reality for Joanna I of Naples, whose reign was forever haunted by the brutal death of her first husband, Andrew of Hungary. Joanna was born in 1326 or 1327 into the Angevin dynasty that ruled the Kingdom of Naples in southern Italy. She was the granddaughter of the reigning King Robert the Wise. King Robert, wanting to sort out succession and unite different branches of the family, decided Joanna should marry her cousin Andrew, who was a prince from the Hungarian branch of the Angevins. They were married when Joanna was just a child, around 6 or 7, and Andrew was a little older. In 1343, King Robert died. In his will, he named Joanna as his heir, to rule Naples and his other territories, like Provence in southern France. Andrew was designated as Duke of Calabria, but the will was a bit vague about whether he would be king alongside Joanna or just her consort. This ambiguity sowed the seeds of future trouble. Joanna, still a teenager, became queen. Andrew, also young and reportedly a bit rough around the edges compared to the sophisticated Neapolitan court, wanted to be crowned king in his own right. He had support from his powerful mother, Queen Elizabeth of Poland, and the Pope, who was the feudal overlord of Naples. This ambition put him at odds with Joanna and many Neapolitan nobles, who didn't want a Hungarian king calling the shots. The court was soon buzzing with factions, intrigue, and resentment towards Andrew and his Hungarian entourage. Joanna herself wasn't keen on sharing power with Andrew. Their marriage was reportedly unhappy. She was intelligent and cultured. He was seen by some as boorish and ill-suited to the refined Neapolitan court. Plus, there were whispers that Joanna had taken a lover, her cousin Louis of Taranto, who was also from a branch of the Angevin family. The tension came to a horrifying head on the night of September 18 to 19, 1345. Joanna and Andrew were staying at a hunting lodge, the monastery of San Pietro e Maiella, in Aversa, near Naples. In the middle of the night, Andrew was lured from his bedchamber by conspirators. According to various accounts, he was attacked in the hallway or a balcony. He fought back but was overpowered, strangled, some stories say with a silken cord, possibly even one plated with gold, a detail that added to the scandal, and his body was thrown from a window into the garden below. His Hungarian nurse, Isolda, found his body and raised the alarm. Andrew was only 17 or 18 years old. The murder was brutal and shocking, and suspicion immediately fell on Queen Joanna. Why? Well, she was known to be unhappy with Andrew. She benefited from his death by potentially securing sole rule. Her behavior after the murder also raised eyebrows. She didn't seem overly distraught, and she was slow to investigate or punish the culprits. Many of those believed to be directly involved in the conspiracy were nobles close to her and her lover, Louis of Taranto. These included members of her own household and even, allegedly, her cousin and close confidant, Catherine of Valois-Courtenay, titular Empress of Constantinople, and Louis of Taranto's mother, which is extra spicy. The whodunit of Andrew's murder became an international scandal. Andrew's older brother, King Louis I of Hungary, was absolutely furious. He accused Joanna directly of orchestrating the murder and vowed revenge. He wrote letters to the Pope and other European rulers, painting Joanna as a monstrous, adulterous queen who had killed her husband. Joanna, meanwhile, tried to consolidate her power. Less than a year after Andrew's death in August 1346, she married her suspected lover, Louis of Taranto. To many, this looked like a massive confirmation of her guilt. Why marry so quickly if you weren't involved? King Louis of Hungary wasn't just writing angry letters. He raised an army and in 1347 invaded Naples to avenge his brother and claim the kingdom for himself. Joanna and her new husband, Louis of Taranto, were forced to flee Naples. They sailed to Provence, which Joanna also ruled. While in exile in Avignon, where the Pope resided at the time, Joanna had to stand trial for Andrew's murder. The trial, held in 1348 before the papal court, was a major event. Joanna defended herself eloquently. Ultimately, she was acquitted. However, the circumstances of the acquittal were a bit fishy. Joanna sold her rights to the city of Avignon to the Pope for a hefty sum of money around the same time. Coincidence, maybe? Or maybe it was a convenient way to get a favorable verdict and some much-needed cash. Even with the papal acquittal, the shadow of Andrew's murder never really left Joanna. She and Louis of Taranto eventually managed to regain Naples after Louis of Hungary, facing his own problems, like the Black Death decimating his army, withdrew. Her reign continued for decades, marked by more political turmoil, wars, more marriages. She had 4 husbands in total, outliving 3 of them, and shifting alliances. She was a patron of the arts and culture, and her court was quite glamorous. But the theme of betrayal would revisit her at the end of her life. In the complex power struggles of the Western Schism, when there were rival popes, Joanna backed the Avignon Pope. This put her at odds with Pope Urban VI in Rome, who excommunicated her and declared her deposed. He offered her kingdom to her ambitious cousin Charles of Durazzo. Charles, whom Joanna had once considered her heir, but later tried to disinherit in favor of Louis I, Duke of Anjou, a French prince, invaded Naples in 1381. Joanna was captured. This time, there was no escape and no trial. In 1382, at the age of about 55 or 56, Queen Joanna, the First of Naples, was killed in prison, likely on Charles of Durazzo's orders. The most common account is that she was smothered with pillows, a strangely domestic end for such a dramatic queen, and perhaps a way to avoid shedding royal blood directly. So did Joanna I mastermind the betrayal and murder of her first husband, Andrew. Historians still debate the extent of her direct involvement. Some argue she was a young, inexperienced queen manipulated by older, more ruthless courtiers. Others believe she was fully complicit, if not the prime mover. What's undeniable is that Andrew's murder was a profound betrayal that shaped her entire reign, leading to war, exile, and endless suspicion. It set the stage for a life lived under a cloud of accusations, a life that itself ended in betrayal and violent death. Number 3. Urraca of Leon and Castile, the warrior queen who fought her husbands and her son. Forget damsels in distress. Queen Urraca of Leon and Castile, who reigned in the early 12th century, was a medieval powerhouse who took on everyone, including her own husbands and even her son, to defend her crown. Her life was a whirlwind of marriages, alliances, wars, and yes, betrayals as she navigated the treacherous world of Iberian politics. Urraca was born around 1080, the eldest and only legitimate surviving child of King Alfonso VI of Leon and Castile. This was a big deal because it meant she was her father's heir. In an era when men usually inherited, Urraca was destined to rule one of the most powerful Christian kingdoms in Iberia, a region then deeply embroiled in the Reconquista against the Muslim Almoravid rulers to the south. Her early life was shaped by these political realities. She was married young to Raymond of Burgundy, a French nobleman who came to Iberia to fight in the Reconquista. They had a son, Alfonso Raimundez, the future Alfonso VII. But Raymond died in 1107. Then, Urraca's half-brother Sancho, who had been Alfonso VI's preferred male heir, died in battle in 1108. Suddenly, Urraca was unquestionably next in line for the throne. King Alfonso VI, knowing his health was failing and worried about the stability of the kingdom under a lone queen, especially with the Almoravid threat, arranged a second marriage for Urraca, his choice. King Alfonso, the first of Aragon and Navarre, famously known as Alfonso the Battler. The idea was that this marriage would unite the Christian kingdoms and create a strong front. It sounded good on paper. In reality, it was a disaster. When Alfonso VI died in 1109, Urraca became Queen of Leon and Castile, and Alfonso I of Aragon became her husband, and in his mind her co-ruler, if not the dominant one. But Urraca and Alfonso the Battler were like oil and water. They were both strong-willed, ambitious rulers, and they clashed almost immediately. Urraca was determined to rule her ancestral lands in her own right, not just be the battler's wife. Alfonso, true to his nickname, was aggressive and wanted to control her kingdoms. Sources even hint at domestic abuse, with reports that Alfonso I physically mistreated Urraca. So, what did Urraca do? She decided to fight back. This is where the betrayals, from her husband's perspective, began. She openly defied Alfonso the Battler, leading her own armies against him. She allied with powerful nobles in her kingdoms who also resented Aragonese interference. The marriage, meant to bring peace instead, plunged Leon and Castile into civil war. Urraca and Alfonso I were literally at war with each other, husband against wife, each claiming supreme authority. Urraca was no figurehead queen. She was actively involved in military campaigns, sieges, and political negotiations. She issued charters in her own name, asserting her authority as Queen of all Spain, or Queen of Castile and Leon. She then sought an annulment of her marriage to Alfonso the Battler on grounds of consanguinity. They were distant cousins, which was eventually granted by the Pope, though Alfonso I didn't readily accept it. During this chaotic period, Urraca also had to deal with another rival, her own son, Alfonso Raimundez. As Urraca battled her husband, some powerful nobles in Galicia, a region within her realm, decided that young Alfonso Raimundez who was being raised there by his tutor, Count Pedro Froilaz de Traba, should be crowned king. They likely saw him as a more pliable ruler, or wanted to secure Galician autonomy. So, while Urraca was fighting one, Alfonso, her husband, she suddenly had another Alfonso, her son, being propped up as a challenger to her authority. Urraca's relationships with her son and his powerful Galician supporters were complicated. Sometimes, she allied with them against Alfonso the Battler. Other times, she saw them as a threat to her own rule and clashed with them. She made and broke alliances, constantly depending on the shifting political landscape. She even had a prominent lover, Count Pedro González de Lara, who became a key supporter and influenced her decisions, much to the annoyance of other noble factions and her son. This relationship further complicated matters, as some nobles resented Lara's power. Imagine the sheer stress, fighting your husband, dealing with rebellious nobles, managing the ambitions of your son's faction, and trying to hold vast kingdoms together, all while the threat of Almoravid attacks loomed from the south. Urraca had to be incredibly resilient and politically astute to survive. Her betrayals were often tactical moves in a desperate game of thrones. She might betray an alliance with one noble faction to secure support from another, or turn against a former ally if they became too powerful or threatened her crown. For example, she sometimes supported her son's claims to Galicia, to keep the Galicians on her side against Alfonso of Aragon, but then reasserted her own supreme authority when she felt strong enough. She betrayed the trust of some by making deals that benefited her immediately, but angered others. It was a constant balancing act. Even after her marriage to Alfonso the Battler was effectively over, the wars continued for several years, as he tried to hold on to territories in Castile. Urraca, with the help of loyal nobles and sometimes even her son's growing forces, gradually pushed him back. By the later years of her reign, her son, Alfonso VII, was coming into his own. He was a young man, eager to rule. While Urraca never formally abdicated or handed over full power, she increasingly had to share authority with him. There were periods of cooperation and periods of tension between mother and son, right up until her death. Urraca died in 1126, in her mid-40s, possibly from complications related to childbirth, from her relationship with Pedro González de Lara. She had ruled for 17 tumultuous years. Her son, Alfonso VII, then became the undisputed king, later even styling himself Emperor of all Spain. Urraca's reign is a testament to a queen's fierce determination to rule in her own name. She defied medieval expectations for women, especially queens, who were often seen as mere consorts or regents. She was a warrior, a diplomat, and a political survivor. Her betrayals of her husband, of certain alliances, sometimes even seemingly of her son's immediate ambitions, though she always protected his ultimate inheritance, were the actions of a monarch desperately trying to maintain her hereditary rights and the integrity of her kingdoms in a brutal male-dominated world. She wasn't just a queen, she was a ruler who truly battled for her crown. Number 2. Fredegund, the Merovingian queen of assassins and deadly schemes, step into the so-called Dark Ages, specifically the Merovingian Frankish kingdoms of the 6th century, and meet Fredegund. If medieval betrayals were an Olympic sport, Fredegund would have a pile of gold medals. This queen wasn't just involved in a bit of courtly intrigue. She was allegedly behind a string of assassinations, poisonings, and brutal political maneuvers that would make a modern-day crime boss blush, her main target. Her arch-rival, Queen Brunhilde. Fredegund's story, mostly told by the historian Gregory of Tours, who, fair warning, was not her biggest fan, starts in the lower rungs of society. She was reportedly a servant in the household of King Chilperic, the first of Neustria, one of the Frankish kingdoms. Chilperic was already married to Audovera, with whom he had several children. But Fredegund, beautiful and ambitious, caught the king's eye and became his mistress. Things took a dark turn. Chilperic, perhaps under Fredegund's influence, set aside his wife, Audovera, who was packed off to a convent. Then Chilperic made a politically advantageous marriage to Galswintha, the sister of Queen Brunhilde of Austrasia, another Frankish kingdom, ruled by Chilperic's brother, Sigebert I. Galswintha came with a hefty dowry and expected Chilperic to dismiss his mistresses, including Fredegund. For a short while, it seems he did, but not for long. Soon after the marriage, Galswintha was found strangled in her bed. Surprise, surprise, Chilperic then married Fredegund, making her Queen of Neustria. Galswintha's sister, Queen Brunhilde, was utterly convinced that Fredegund had masterminded Galswintha's murder, and so began one of the most bitter, violent, and long-lasting feuds in medieval history. A blood feud between two queens that would span decades and involve multiple generations. Fredegund, now queen, was determined to secure her position and the future of her own children with Chilperic. This meant eliminating any potential rivals. According to Gregory of Tours, her list of alleged victims and targets was long and distinguished. First, there were Chilperic's sons from his first wife, Audovera. The eldest, Theudebert, was killed in battle. But Clovis and Merovesh were still around. Merovesh made the mistake of marrying his aunt by marriage, the widowed Brunhilde, yes, Fredegund's nemesis. This was a political power play, and Fredegund and Chilperic saw it as treason. Merovesh was hunted down. Cornered and fearing torture, he supposedly asked his own servant to kill him in 577. Fredegund was widely blamed for orchestrating the circumstances that led to his death. Later, Audovera's last surviving son, Clovis, was also targeted. Fredegund accused him of witchcraft and involvement in the death of her own young sons, who died of dysentery, a common killer. Clovis was imprisoned and then murdered, stabbed to death reportedly, on Fredegund's orders. Even Audovera herself was later murdered in her convent. Then there was Sigebert, the first of Austrasia, Brunhilde's husband, and Chilperic's brother. In 575, Sigebert was winning a war against Chilperic and was about to be acclaimed king of Neustria as well. Just as he was being raised on the shields by his new subjects, two young men, allegedly hired by Fredegund, rushed forward and stabbed Sigebert with poisoned daggers called scramasaxes. Sigebert died, Chilperic was saved, and Fredegund had chalked up another major victory. This was a direct hit against her main rival's power base. Brunhilde herself was a constant target. Fredegund is said to have sent multiple assassins after Brunhilde and Brunhilde's son, Childebert II, who became king of Austrasia after Sigebert's murder. One assassin was sent with a poisoned knife to kill Brunhilde. but he failed and was caught. Another plot involved trying to poison Childebert II. Even high-ranking church officials weren't safe if they crossed Fredegund. Praetextatus, the bishop of Rouen, had officiated Merovecc's marriage to Brunhilde and had criticized Fredegund. While Praetextus was celebrating Easter Mass in his cathedral in 586, an assassin, again allegedly sent by Fredegund, stabbed him. The bishop lingered for a few days, even accusing Fredegund from his deathbed, before succumbing to his wounds. Fredegund's methods were varied: poison, daggers, false accusations, political manipulation. She was accused of using seduction to turn men to her cause, and then disposing of them when they were no longer useful. She was portrayed as a master of dissimulation, able to appear charming one moment and order a brutal killing the next. Her betrayals weren't just personal. They were strategic moves to consolidate her husband's power, and thus her own, and to ensure the succession of her son, Clotaire II. Her own young children with Chilperic kept dying in infancy, which must have made her even more desperate and ruthless to protect the one who eventually survived, Clotaire II. King Chilperic I himself was assassinated in 584, stabbed by an unknown assailant while returning from a hunt. Some contemporary whispers even implicated Fredegund, suggesting she feared he might finally turn against her, or that she was involved with one of his officials. However, Gregory of Tours doesn't directly accuse her of this one, and it's more likely political enemies of Chilperic were responsible. Whatever the case, Fredegund found herself a widow, with her young son Clotaire II as the new king. Her position was precarious, but Fredegund was nothing if not a survivor. She quickly sought the protection of King Guntram of Burgundy, Chilperic's other brother, who had a complex relationship with both Fredegund and Brunhilde. She managed to secure the regency for her son Clotaire II in Neustria, and continued her machinations mainly focused on protecting his throne and undermining Brunhilde and Childebert II. Amazingly, despite her life of alleged violence and treachery, Fredegund died peacefully in her bed in 597. She had successfully defended her son's kingdom and his claim to the throne. Her son, Clotaire II, would go on to outlive Brunhilde's descendants, and eventually, in 613, become king of all the Franks. And what of Brunhilde? Her end was horrific. After decades of rivalry, she was eventually captured by Fredegund's son, Clotaire II. Accused of the deaths of 10 Frankish kings, a wildly exaggerated charge, but it shows the hatred, the elderly Brunhilde was tortured for 3 days and then executed by being tied to the tail of a wild horse and dragged to her death. It was a brutal end to a brutal feud, one that Fredegund had arguably started with the murder of Galswintha. Fredegund's legacy, largely shaped by her enemy, Gregory of Tours, is that of one of history's most wicked queens. Her betrayals were numerous and shocking, betraying her first queen Ottovera, betraying Galswintha, betraying her marriage vows through ruthless ambition, betraying anyone who stood in the path of her power or her son's succession. She was a master of the deadly political game in a violent age, using betrayal as her primary weapon. Number 1. Isabella of France, the she-wolf who toppled the king with her lover. Topping our list is a queen whose betrayal was so audacious, so dramatic, it changed the course of English history. Isabella of France, dubbed the she-wolf of France, didn't just cheat on her husband, King Edward II of England. She teamed up with her lover, raised an army, invaded England, and had him overthrown. This is the ultimate royal soap opera, complete with a despised king, a scorned queen, powerful favorites, and a whole lot of drama. Isabella was born around 1295, the daughter of the powerful King Philip IV of France, Philip the Fair. She was beautiful, intelligent, and came from a line of strong rulers. In 1308, at the tender age of about 12, she was married to King Edward II of England as part of a political alliance. It was a typical royal marriage, meant to bring peace and stability between England and France. However, Edward II was not exactly a model husband or king. He was known for his intense attachments to male favorites. The first was Piers Gaveston. Edward lavished Gaveston with titles, lands, and affection, alienating many powerful English barons, and crucially his young wife, Isabella. The barons felt Gaveston was arrogant and had too much influence over the king. Isabella felt neglected and humiliated. Gaveston even reportedly treated Isabella disrespectfully, and Edward seemed to prioritize Gaveston over her. This period was incredibly difficult for the young queen. Gaveston was eventually exiled and then murdered by a group of barons in 1312. For a while after Gaveston's death, Isabella and Edward's relationship seemed to improve. They had 4 children, including the future King Edward III. Isabella undertook diplomatic missions and was seen as a loyal queen. But then, a new favorite emerged. Hugh Despenser the Younger, along with his father, Hugh Despenser the Elder. The Despensers quickly became even more powerful and more hated than Gaveston had been. They were seen as greedy and corrupt, enriching themselves at the expense of the crown and the nobility. They monopolized Edward II's attention and affection, and they made powerful enemies. Crucially, they also began to alienate Isabella. They apparently saw her as a threat, restricted her access to the king, confiscated some of her lands, and even removed her children from her care for a time. Isabella, once a respected queen, found herself increasingly isolated and powerless. The situation reached a breaking point in 1325. There was a dispute between England and France over Gascony, an English territory in France. Isabella, being the French king's sister, her brother Charles IV was now on the French throne, was sent to France to negotiate a peace treaty. This was her chance. Once in France, Isabella made it clear she was not coming back to England as long as the Despensers held power. She publicly denounced them and their influence over Edward II. And then things got even more scandalous. In Paris, she linked up with Roger Mortimer, 1st Earl of March. Mortimer was a powerful English baron who had been one of the leaders of a failed rebellion against Edward II and the Despensers a few years earlier. He had been imprisoned in the Tower of London, but had made a daring escape and fled to France. Isabella and Roger Mortimer became lovers. This was a massive betrayal of her marriage vows, but it was also a political alliance. Together, they became the focal point for all the discontented English nobles who hated Edward II's rule and the Despensers. They began to plot an invasion of England. Isabella played her role brilliantly. She presented herself as a wronged wife and queen, seeking only to free her husband from evil counselors and restore good governance to England. She gathered support and funds, even betrothing her young son, Prince Edward, who had joined her in France, supposedly to pay homage to the French king for Gascony, to Philippa, the daughter of William, Count of Hainaut, in exchange for troops and ships. In September 1326, Isabella and Mortimer launched their invasion. They landed in England with a small mercenary army. But they didn't need a huge force. The country was ripe for rebellion. As soon as they landed, support for them swelled. Nobles who despised the Despensers and were fed up with Edward II flocked to Isabella's banner. Edward II's regime crumbled with astonishing speed. The Despensers were captured and brutally executed. Hugh Despenser, the younger's death was particularly gruesome, involving castration, disembowelment, and quartering, all carried out publicly. King Edward II himself tried to flee but was eventually captured in Wales in November 1326. With the king a prisoner, Isabella and Mortimer were in control. Edward II was forced to abdicate the throne in January 1327 in favor of his young son, who became King Edward III. This was a momentous event. A reigning English king forced from his throne by his wife and her lover. Edward II was kept imprisoned first at Kenilworth Castle and then at Berkeley Castle. In September 1327, it was announced that he had died. The official cause of death was natural causes, but almost no one believed it. The widely accepted story, though difficult to prove definitively, is that he was murdered on the orders of Isabella and Mortimer to prevent any chance of him being restored to power. The rumored method of his murder, having a red-hot poker inserted into his anus, was particularly horrific and symbolic, possibly a grim comment on his alleged homosexuality. For the next 3 years, Isabella and Mortimer ruled England as regents for the young Edward III. They were effectively king and queen in all but name. Mortimer became incredibly wealthy and arrogant, taking on grand titles and estates. Isabella, the she-wolf, had avenged her humiliations and seized power. However, their rule quickly became unpopular. They made a peace treaty with Scotland that was seen as shameful. Mortimer's greed and arrogance alienated many. And young King Edward III was growing up, resentful of being a puppet ruler, controlled by his mother and her lover. In October 1330, Edward III, now 18, decided he'd had enough. He launched a surprise coup. With a small group of loyal companions, he entered Nottingham Castle through a secret passage, allegedly shown to him by the castle's governor, and arrested Mortimer. Isabella reportedly pleaded for her son too. "Fair son, have pity on gentle Mortimer." But Edward III was not in a merciful mood. Roger Mortimer was tried for treason, including his role in Edward II's death, and was hanged, drawn, and quartered in November 1330. And what of Isabella? For her role in the Betrayals, she could have faced a similar fate. But Edward III showed more leniency towards his mother. She was initially placed under house arrest, her lands and wealth temporarily confiscated. However, she was not imprisoned for long. She was allowed to live in comfortable retirement in various castles, most notably Castle Rising in Norfolk, she still had a substantial income and was occasionally visited by her son. She even took an interest in religious orders in her later years. Isabella of France died in 1358, almost 30 years after Mortimer's execution. Her legacy is complex. To some, she was a heroine who liberated England from a disastrous king and his corrupt favorites. To others, she was a ruthless, adulterous traitor who betrayed her husband and king in the most dramatic way possible, seizing power for herself and her lover. Whatever your view, there's no denying that Isabella's meticulously planned and boldly executed betrayal was one of the greatest and most able in medieval history, forever earning her the title of the She-Wolf.